Well, good morning. So excited about being together this morning. We're going to look at one of the most famous stories in not just the Bible, but probably all of literature. And it's 1 Samuel 17, if you want to turn there. And if you need a Bible, you can raise your hand. We'll give you one. We're also going to put a lot of these texts on the screen because just a version of the story that we're going to look at this morning. A little different than we're going to put in your hand, but you can follow along either way. I love this story. We are looking at David and Goliath, and we love the underdog story, right? I mean, we can't help but root for the underdog. When you see someone getting bullied, you want to fight for the underdog. There's something in us we love. We're drawn to the underdog. Maybe it's because we feel like underdogs when we look at what's going on globally and with empires and huge multinational lobbying. We feel like we're hopeless. We need someone who can help stand in the gap for us and fight for us. And maybe that's why we're drawn to the underdog story. I don't know. Maybe it's because we're all fighting our own giants. And we know that too. Maybe we love the story of David and Goliath because we have all come to recognize that just because you're in Christ doesn't mean that you're out of the fight. How many of you, at some point along the way, you thought if you just say yes to Jesus, then it's all smooth sailing? You were lied to. Just because you're in Christ doesn't mean that you're not in the fight. It actually might intensify things. And this morning, we come to the story recognizing, man, every one of us are fighting battles, and every one of us, at some point or another, are going to have to face giants. And we're going to see what happens in the story. You probably know it already. But we are going to read through this story, and it's so good, this story, that even if we just read the story and sang a couple songs, you'd be like, church was amazing. The story is just amazing. And just rereading it for the last couple of weeks, I'm like, I do love this. But we're going to just pause and make some comments along the way that I hope, basically, here's my hope by the end of this. I hope that you have a renewed conviction that no matter what you're fighting, God can give you victory. That our God is strong. He can be your strength, like Stolz just said. And no matter how big those enemies are, and no matter how bad the battle is going in your life, that we would come away from this morning with a renewed conviction and expectation that God can set us free. Okay? So we're going to read through this together, and we're going to talk, and I hope that it just delights you as it does for me. So we'll start in verse 1. The Philistines assembled their troops for war. Verse 2, Saul and the Israelite army assembled and camped in the valley of Elah, where they organized to fight the Philistines. Philistines took positions on one hill, Israel took positions on the opposite hill, and there was a valley between them. Okay, let's just pause there. So the Philistines, you've probably heard a lot about the Philistines if you grew up in church. It's like they're constantly just like a problem for Israel. And this is encouraging to me because it's not like Israel's always facing these new enemies that they've never seen before. It's kind of the same ones over and over. It's the Amalekites here, it's the Philistines there. And that's probably true in your life too. It's probably true that you keep kind of getting tripped up by the same things that have always kind of tripped you up. And you keep needing God to give you victory over the things that he gave you victory over last time too. You all with me? It's probably not a brand new, unheard of temptation that's gonna wipe you out. It's probably the same song, second verse, third verse, fourth verse, where we still have to be on guard against these perennial enemies of our soul. But the Philistines in particular were a little bit more advanced technologically than Israel. I mean, Israel spent 400 years in slavery. They weren't exactly progressing in terms of military strength and strategy. And during all this time, Egypt's got chariots. Well, the Philistines had metals. And Israel didn't have these. The Philistines, you're going to see, they worked in bronze and iron. So we'll see how that comes into play right here, verse 4. A champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was more than 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, wore bronze scale armor weighing 125 pounds. He had bronze plates on his shins and a bronze scimitar. I want a scimitar. Hung on his back. His spear shaft was as strong as the bar on a weaver's loom, and its iron head weighed 15 pounds. His shield bearer walked in front of him, 9 feet 6 inches. That's hard to even wrap my head around. Let me show you a picture of a man who's the tallest man that we have on record. 8'11". This is Robert Wadlow in the 1930s, the tallest man that, science has at least recorded. He weighed 439 pounds. He wore a size 37 shoe, Robert Wadlow. And listen, his dad over there on the right is 6'1". I'm 6'1". Look at that dude. Goliath is 7 inches taller than that. Okay, I couldn't find a photograph of anyone taller than Robert Wadlow. So I want you to, just imagine how big this guy is. And you see all this stuff, and he's got this metal, and he's got bronze, and he's got iron. He's got something that Israel cannot compete with. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 8, Goliath stopped and shouted to the Israelite troops, "Why have you come and taken up battle formations? I am the Philistine champion, and you are Saul's servants. Isn't that right? Select one of your men. Let him come down against me. If he's able to fight and kill me, then we will become your slaves. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our slaves, and you will serve us. I insult Israel's troops today." The Philistine continued, "Give me an opponent, and we'll fight." When Saul and all Israel heard what the Philistine said, they were distressed and terrified. You would have been too. I would have been too. This is called representative warfare. It's not too uncommon where two armies, instead of having all kinds of bloodshed and lives lost, they would say, "Look, you pick your warrior, we'll pick ours. Whoever wins, we can save a lot of frustration here, save a lot of lives." That's what they say they're going to do, representative warfare. But listen again, when Saul and Israel heard what the Philistines said, they were distressed and terrified. Okay, the next few verses are going to set up David, okay, the next character in our story. And it's going to tell you about David being the youngest of 8 brothers and how David's 3 oldest brothers are all in Saul's army at this battle. Okay, so let's go to verse 16. For 40 days straight, the Philistine came out, took his stand both morning and evening. 40 days, morning and evening. Jesse said to his son David, "Please take your brothers some roasted grain, these loaves of bread, deliver them quickly to your brothers in the camp. And here, take these 10 wedges of cheese to their unit commander. Find out how your brothers are doing. Bring back some sign that they are okay." And so Jesse, this man who's getting older in Bethlehem, he sends his son David, who's just a shepherd, out to the battle. And he wants his son to take his older brothers, some hors d'oeuvres. So here's some grain, here's some bread, take some cheese to the general, maybe it'll get good graces for the boys. And bring back a report of how your brothers are doing. Not exactly I am an email back then. So bring us back a report of how things are going. So David sets off on his journey. This is verse 20 and 21 and verse 22. David left his things with an attendant and ran to the front line. When he arrived, he asked how his brothers were doing. Got to get that report for dad. Right when David was speaking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came forward from the Philistine ranks and said the same things he'd said before. David listened. What had Saul said before? What did Goliath said before? "You are the servants of Saul. I insult you." That's what he'd said. Remember, 40 days he said that, day and night. And David listened. Okay, the next couple verses, verse 24, 25, we're going to see that basically the people are terrified. Every time Goliath comes out, like we already saw, they're distressed and terrified. So halfway through verse 26, David says, "Who is that uncircumcised Philistine that he can get away with insulting the army of the living God?" Look at that. 40 days, 40 nights, Goliath says, "You are the servants of Saul. I insult you." David shows up and he says, "Wait, who's this guy?" He hadn't been indoctrinated for 40 days. He just says, "Who is he?" See, Saul and Israel are asking, "Who are we? We can't do anything about this guy." Someone after the first service came up and said, Saul saw someone too big to beat. David saw a target too big to miss. I like that. Saul's asking, like, who are we? The army's going, who are we? We can't do anything about it. He's 9'6". I mean, he's a monster. David says, wait, who is he? Do you see wisdom isn't just having the right answers, but asking the right questions? Who is he? If you ask the right questions, you're well on your way to getting the right answer. But if you're asking the wrong questions, who are we? Who are we? We could never. And Saul and Israel just end up terrified. But Israel, David is not afraid. David is offended. He is offended by the name of God being dishonored. His heart, I mean, remember, David's young at this point. He's a shepherd. He's writing poems out there in the wilderness. You know, David didn't know he was writing the Bible. He's just writing his prayers. He's just writing his love for God. And he's got such a tender walk with the Lord that when he hears someone dishonoring the Lord, he is personally offended. How about us? Are our hearts that tender that we're offended when God's name is dishonored? David was just that. And everyone else is terrified, but David is ticked because David recognizes Goliath isn't just challenging Israel. He's challenging the God of Israel. Verse 28. When David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard him talking to the soldiers, he got very mad at David. Why did you come down here? Who's watching those few sheep for you in the wilderness? I know how arrogant you are and your devious plan. You came down just to see the battle. What did I do wrong this time? David replied. It was just a question. Isn't this funny? Like, what a funny little detail in the middle of the story, a little sibling squabble. I'm thankful for this. I've got 4 boys, not 8, But even just in my 4 boys, sometimes there can be just stupid competition and projection going on between these boys. And you see it right here. It's happening here too. I mean, my kids are perfect, but Jesse's kids had, they had some kind of, Eliab's like projecting something onto David. So you just came down here to see a bloody battle. David didn't do that. He came actually to serve Eliab. You ever been misunderstood? David had. We'll keep going. Verse 32. Don't let anyone lose courage because of this Philistine, David told Saul. I, your servant, will go and fight him. So David's asking these questions. Who is that guy? Who is that guy? And more people start hearing what David is asking. And word gets to Saul. Saul says, come here. So Saul wants to talk to David. So David gets before Saul and says, I'll go out and fight him. Verse 33, you can't go out and fight the Philistine. You're still a boy. He's been a warrior since he was a boy. It's a funny little play on words. You're just a boy. He's been a warrior since he was a boy. He's been fighting longer than you've been living, is what it's saying. You're no match for this guy. But verse 34, your servant has kept his father's sheep. And if a lion or a bear came and carried off one of the flocks, I would go after it, strike it, and rescue the animal from its mouth. If it turned on me, I would grab it at its jaw, strike it, and kill it. Your servant has fought both lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them because he has insulted the army of the living God. The Lord, David added, who rescued me from the power of both lions and bears, will rescue me from the power of this Philistine. Go, Saul replied to David, and may the Lord be with you. Saul ends up giving David the best thing he could possibly give him, just that blessing. Go, and may the Lord be with you. We need to pause right here because David, there's a key that we see here. What gives David the confidence to feel like he can go face this next threat? Why does David see what others see as a threat as an opportunity? And here's why. He remembers what God had done in the past, and that gives him the faith to respond to the future. He isn't oblivious to what God had done. He specifically cites, no, God did this, God did that, gave me victory over this, he protected me here, so this guy's nothing for me. David looks back at the past, he remembers the past, and that gives him the faith to be able to respond to what's coming to him next. See, I just wonder, like, how many times are we faced with something in the present or in the future? And if we would remember what God had done in the past, we would have the faith to face it without fear. But instead, we've forgotten what God has done in the past. We don't keep a very good record of that stuff. We just kind of get myopic, sucked into the moment, and we get overwhelmed really quickly with anxiety and burden and fear and all this stuff. David specifically goes back to, God did this, God did that, God did this, so this is nothing for me. Listen to what it says in Psalm 77, verse 11. I will remember the Lord's deeds. Yes, I will remember your wondrous acts. I will meditate on your works. I will ponder your deeds. That's from Asaph. He was influenced by David. Here's what I want you to hear. Recalling God's faithfulness in the past stirs faith in us for what we need in the future. This is why worship can be so powerful. It's not too dissimilar from what Saul talked about last week in 1 Samuel 16. Saul's tormented by those spirits, remember? And David would play the harp. There's something about going back when we are being beaten down by discouragement or despondency or despair, when we're being beaten down by all this stuff. And can we just be honest? This stuff hits us. This hits us. I don't wake up and go through all of my day usually just with on the front of my mind all the things that God's done for me. By 8:30 in the morning, I'm already stressing about how I'm gonna send my kids to college, This stuff just comes all the time, and we have to be diligent, we have to be disciplined to go back and remember, I remember what God did. I meditate on your deeds. I will ponder what you've done. This is where worship can be so powerful because it's a chance for us to remind ourselves of what God's done for us. Remind ourselves of how God's fought for us. Remind ourselves of how he has provided. And I think it's important that we see David does just that. He remembers, he goes specifically, and it gives him a boldness to run into a battle that everybody else is running from. It reminds me of Proverbs 28. It says, the wicked will flee though no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. Isn't that good? The righteous are bold as a lion. That's what we see in David. He's gonna show us a type of the Lion of Judah, but here he's so bold in his confrontation with Saul. I was at a camp this week leading worship for Providence Christian Academy, and I love this school, and for 12 or 13 years, I've been leading worship every September for their high school. They get away for a week and they do like a spiritual emphasis kind of thing, and it's really awesome. So this week, it was Rob Capel was preaching, and Rob, you probably haven't met Rob yet, but he's one of our pastors down at Midtown, at Grace Midtown. And he's an amazing preacher, and he's a great friend. And Rob, we were doing one session with just the seniors. So it's a bunch of seniors in high school, I'm leading worship, and Rob's speaking. And Rob had this one word that I thought was so helpful. He said, when I was a senior in high school, someone handed me a book, and it was called How to Not Lose Your Faith in College. Someone's trying to help him out, like, we don't want you to lose your faith, it's gonna be attacked by all kinds of stuff, secular materialism or whatever. And so how to not lose your faith. I actually did 2 weeks in Colorado at a camp before I went to college to make sure I didn't lose my faith in college. Summit Ministries, And Rob's word was this. There's nothing wrong with that, but here's what Rob said. He said, I wanna write a book called How to Lead Revival at College. See the difference? The whole different, like one of them's like how to not get beat up too bad. The other is how to win. And how to not just survive, but how to thrive, how to flourish. I loved that word. That's what I see in David. Everyone else is like, how do we not lose this thing? David's like, how could we lose this thing? And at this point, let's just pause and notice something. The details in this story are surprising. For me, it's so funny, the details. Like, why does it talk about David's little sibling rivalry? Why do we need to know the weight of Goliath's spear tip? Like, why does it tell us about 10 wedges of cheese? And here's why I think these stories are so powerful for us. The Bible is for real people. not just for abstract kind of mythology and principles. These are real people who really know what it's like to have conflict in a family, to know what it's like to feel intimidated by the size of an obstacle, to know what it's like to just go through the routine of bread, cheese, sheep. Real people, you see what I'm saying? Like, this is a real story for real people. That's good. We're not just talking about some abstraction way out there on the other side of some sky. And what we're seeing is that God's not just a God who speaks. We've been seeing that so far in 1 Samuel. We're going to see God as a God who acts. And that's good. We are real people who need a real God who really moves. Verse 38, Saul dressed David in his own gear, putting a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David strapped his sword over the armor, but he couldn't walk around well because he'd never tried it before. I can't walk in this because I've never tried it before. So he took them off. This is a funny scene to me. Saul's putting his armor. Saul is a grown man. David is a boy. And he's putting this heavy armor. David's like clunking around in this armor. He's like, I can't do this. I've never done this before. I can't do this. So what does David do? He takes them off. Verse 40, he grabs his staff. He chooses 5 smooth stones from the stream bed, puts them in the pocket of the shepherd's bag with sling in hand, and goes out to the Philistine. Philistine got closer and closer to David, and his shield bearer was in front of him. When the Philistine looked David over, he sneered at David because he was just a boy, reddish brown and good looking. The details are hilarious. David's hot. It's like the E channel. Philistine asked David, am I some sort of dog that you come at me with sticks? He cursed David by his gods. Again, the gods are involved. Come here, he said to David. I'll feed your flesh to the wild birds and the wild animals. But David told the Philistine, you are coming against me with sword, spear, and scimitar, but I come against you in the name of the Lord. David picks up 5 smooth stones. Stones get smoothed out in a river. So there is a little stream going through this valley, as there often are. David bends over. He picks up 5 stones. Some say 5 because Goliath, we can find out in Chronicles, has 4 brothers. David is aware that when you take down one, watch out. Another one could be right around the corner. Haven't you seen that in your own life? You get victory over one thing, and then, whoa, this one's even nastier than the last. You got to keep your guard up. David isn't presumptuous. David is prepared. He's got 5 smooth stones, and he's running into this battle. And I like it because you see Goliath expects a different kind of fight, obviously. Goliath, even the language, Goliath is like, verse 44, come here. You see it even in verse 10, give me an opponent and we will fight. Well, there's not gonna be much of a fight. Goliath is like, come here. David's not gonna come to him. David can't hang in that kind of a fight. This is a whole different fight that David's bringing to Goliath, and that's exactly what we're gonna see. But Saul also expected the same kind of fight that Goliath did. So that's why Saul's trying to put his armor on him. You're gonna need this. You're gonna need this to protect you, because when you get in there and you're hand to hand with this guy, guys, David was not gonna fight this thing the way that Saul would have fought it. And that's a big point. We'll come back to that in just a second. But it reminds me of Psalm 44. Not by swords did they take possession of the land. Their own arms didn't save them. No, it was your strong hand, your arm, the light of your face, because you were pleased with them. See, God has different ideas. All we can see is this one thing, but God sees a whole different option of how he's gonna give us victory than we could possibly even imagine. Okay, verse 45, you come against me, sword, spear, scimitar, I come against you in the name of the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel's army, the one you've insulted. So David's gonna trash talk for a few more verses. And in verse 47, it says, all those gathered here will know that the Lord doesn't save by means of sword and spear. The Lord owns this war. He will hand you over to all of us. Verse 48, so the Philistine got up and moved closer to attack David, and David ran quickly to the front line to face him. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, he slung it, and it hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone penetrated his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. And that's how David triumphed over the Philistine, with just a sling and a stone, striking the Philistine down and killing him. And David didn't even have a sword. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, drew it from its sheath, and finished him off. David cut off the Philistine's head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. The famous painting from Caravaggio in 1607 of young shepherd David holding up the decapitated head of the Philistine champion. Amazing story, and it got the attention of Malcolm Gladwell, kind of a popular social anthropologist in the last few years, who wrote a great book where he's kind of studying this from a whole different angle. And he brought in ballistics experts to look at how did this really work. And so he studied like slingers, these guys who worked with slingshots, and how they could take down infantrymen, these huge, big, brutal guys that would do hand-to-hand combat. And they looked at, I love the internet, right? They looked at the density of the stones in the Valley of Elah and the speed that a stone might come out of a sling if it was being slung. 6 or 7 times a second, they reckon. And they said, this is going 35 meters per second, which is faster than a Major League Baseball pitcher. And they said by the time it hit his forehead, it would have hit with the same force as a 45 caliber bullet. Now, I don't know about ballistics. I don't know about the physics of all that. But what I know is God somehow did something completely unexpected. David all he's got is a sling and a stone. Goliath has 125 pounds of armor. He's a sitting duck for David. Goliath, this is Gladwell's point in his book, Goliath had no chance. This was no contest, because what looked so intimidating and so, defeating in Goliath was actually his biggest weakness. And it's a really interesting little story, his book, about what if your biggest strength is your biggest weakness, and what looks like just a little sling in your life is actually your biggest strength. Pretty good stuff from Gladwell, but I don't want to go too much further into that. I want to look at a couple last things before we begin to wrap this up. And it's in the last couple verses of this chapter that I think we unlock what was underneath David's confidence. Not just a memory of the past, but even something else. Verse 55. When Saul saw David go out to meet the Philistine, he asked Abner, the army general, Abner, whose son is that boy? Surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know. Then find out whose son that young man is. So when David came back from killing the Philistine, Abner sent for him, presented him to Saul. The Philistine's head was still in David's hand. Saul said to him, whose son are you, my boy? I'm the son of your servant, Jesse, from Bethlehem. David answered. Whose son are you? See, to me, that last little section gives us the key to the whole confidence. David knew who he was. Saul was a very different identity than David. Saul's awareness of himself was, I'm not enough. I'm insecure. I'm intimidated. I'm afraid. Saul was an insecure king, and we're going to see what happens as we keep going through 1 Samuel through the next couple months. But David was just a humble son of a servant. He was a shepherd, and David had spent a lot of time hanging out with the sheep. There's probably not a lot to do out there. So he's writing his prayers down. He's probably practicing with that sling. And these slingers were supposed to have been able to hit like a bird out of the sky from 200 feet. These guys like practicing. David winning victory after victory after victory out away from the spotlights. No crowd watching him do that. See, there's a humility in David that I think we see. Again, he's really young here. This is really early. This is before some of the complications really start with David. But we see in David a confidence in who he is. He knows who he is. He knows what he carries. And that's so important because we don't look at life with a neutral perspective. You don't see anything with a completely neutral paradigm. Your worldview paints what you see. Remember the dress a few years ago? Some people see it's this color. Some people see it's that color. Like, we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. That's important to know. You can't really change that, but it's helpful to recognize that that's happening. So I, growing up the way I did as a white male in South Carolina, see things differently than someone with different skin in a different state might have grown up seeing things. I need to know that. I need to be aware of that. I see things the way I am. You with me? You don't see things neutrally. And so the way that Saul sees things paralyzes him. The way that David sees things mobilizes him. Without an identity that's grounded in confidence in God, we have very little to be secure in. Very little to be sure about in our lives. If we can only measure ourselves by like our personalities or what we've accomplished, guys, that's not very much room for stability in your life. And I'm afraid that these days we kind of have identity amnesia. We've kind of forgotten. We've forgotten what God's done for us in the past. We've forgotten what he's called us. We've forgotten all that he's given to us. And we only end up measuring ourselves by the little victories here or there. And that's a big problem because David knows who he is, has a confidence in his identity, and he's able to then move in authenticity. So that's the whole thing. When Saul tries to put his armor on David, David's able to say, that's not me. I can't do that. Have you ever had a church or a spiritual leader or someone try to put their armor on you and you're like, this just doesn't fit. This isn't working. It happens all the time. God doesn't do like assembly line Christians. That's what pharaohs do with bricks, but we are living stones being fitted together. That's how 1 Peter says it. Living stones being fitted together, and you're unique and you're different than the person beside you. And God knows that. God knows exactly what you need. God's able to work specifically with what you need, but David can't do this how Saul would have done it. It would have been the end of David and Israel. David can't do how Saul would have done, and he can't do what Saul would have done. David was authentic to, I don't have any experience. I haven't done that before. This is what I know. This is what I have. This is what I'm going to do. He's authentic to himself. I mean, the king's armor would have been custom tailored to his body. Imagine, big old Saul trying to put this hilarious heavy armor on little David. It never would have worked. It would have worked for Saul. And that's the amazing thing. What would have helped Saul would have hindered David. This is why you need to know what God's called you to do and how God's called you to be, because that might look different than your spouse. It might look different than me or than John. And if we don't take how God's wired us into account of our spiritual life, we'll end up sometimes feeling less than others because we just aren't wired that way. I've seen this happen over and over and over. We need to recognize, no, the way that God's wired us means we need to be faithful to engage with him in this way. The way that God's wired her, God's done something different. I don't need to project my armor onto my wife, for instance. And I don't need her to try to take her armor and put it on me. David had to be himself. He couldn't be Saul. He can't do it Saul's way. He can't fight Saul's battles because God doesn't copy and paste. He uniquely, fearfully, and wonderfully makes. He's a handcrafter, not a not a mass producer. See, things would go bad. I was having dinner last night with Chloe Brothers. She's one of our family's friends. She's a little 11-year-old gymnast. We went up Stone Mountain a couple weeks ago with her family. And I mean, Chloe is jumping up onto rocks, like hanging kind of over like little cliffs doing handstands. I'm like, Chloe, please. I'm stressing out here, you know. And if Chloe's little gymnast trainer did the same workout as the Brookwood offensive line coach, you end up with some really funky looking people. We just say that? So you train an 80-pound gymnast very differently than a 250-pound linebacker. We get that in sports, but we miss that in church sometimes. And we think everyone has to do the same thing. No, you need to know how God's wired you, and we have so many resources available. We want you to know how God's wired you. We want you to know what God's called you and where he's called you. That's why we have unique happening all the time around here, because God's made you uniquely, and no one's ever seen the world like you. So God's existed from before eternity, but you haven't, and there's never been anyone like you. Nobody has ever been able to give to God what you can. So what a shame when we aren't authentic, when we aren't aware of what God has given us uniquely. What a sad tragedy when we end up just imitating and trying to be someone else. God's already got that. Only you can give what only you have. But you need to know what you have. Obviously, it's true you can't give what you don't possess, but you also won't give what you don't know you possess. You need to know what you possess. David knew what he possessed. God's doing a new thing in you. He works differently. I love John Ortberg. He's one of my heroes, pastor and author. Here's how he said it. He said, our great model for this is God himself. He always knows just what each person needs. He had Abraham take a walk, Elijah take a nap, Joshua take a lap, and Adam take the rap. He gave Moses a 40-year timeout, and gave David a harp and a dance, he gave Paul a pen and a scroll. He wrestled with Jacob, argued with Job, whispered to Elijah, warned Cain, and comforted Hagar. He gave Aaron an altar, Miriam a song, Gideon a fleece, Peter a name, and Elisha a mantle. It's unique. Every person, unique. God doesn't copy and paste. Jesus does a similar pattern. He follows a similar pattern. Jesus was stern with the rich young ruler, tender with the woman caught in adultery, patient with the disciples, blistering with the scribes, gentle with children, and gracious with the thief on the cross. So we need to understand how God's wired us, and then we need to dignify people in how God's wired them. We need to have that kind of perspective and paradigm to honor people. David knew who he was. He knew what he carried. He's the youngest of his brothers. He's just a shepherd out there working things out in obscurity and monotony, but he has an integrity. He's won these battles out in isolation, and he's kneeling down to go to the front lines. There's a humility there. And I like that. Knowing who you are and authentically being that doesn't lead to pride, it leads to humility. Because you know who you are and you know what you're not. You can just simply carry what God's given you to carry without feeling the weight of, I have to project that I'm all these things that I'm not. No, I know what I'm not. So I can actually be quite humble about what I am, because it's just from God anyway. David is able to then step from just authenticity into authority, because look, your authority is directly connected to your identity. Identity is basically how you view yourself. How do you see yourself? David saw himself as a son, as a shepherd who God had delivered in the past. He had no problem looking at giants in his present or in the future. And guys, look, if the enemy can't steal our identity, he's gonna try to diminish it. The Thigpens are sitting here. Their son was one of my best friends in college, and he graduated from Parkview High School. But then he went on to graduate from Furman and get a doctorate from Harvard. Okay. So Tyler's one of the smartest people I know. He was one of our youth pastors back in the day here at Grace. And if Tyler were in the room and coming on stage, I wouldn't introduce Tyler and say, guys, this is Tyler. He graduated from Parkview. So, go Panthers. No, why? Because while that's true, that doesn't connote one bit of the expertise that he's gained since then. See, Tyler has a doctorate from Harvard, so that brings an expertise and authority that isn't there if I diminish it to something else. That makes sense? You don't introduce a 4-star general in the army as a cadet. No, why? Because their rank brings with it a certain authority in the army. And what I want you to hear is, guys, Goliath comes out for 40 days and says the same thing. You are the servants of Saul. I insult you. Every morning and then every night. You are the servants of Saul. I defy you. 40 days. Guess how long it takes for your brain to establish a new neural connection so you just believe stuff? Guess how long? Come on, not a trick question. 40 days. Guess how long it takes to pick up a new habit? 40 days. Guys, do you know how advertising works? Advertising is this. If I keep hitting you with the same message about a product, eventually you'll believe it. So it's worth it to Coca-Cola to spend millions for 30 seconds at the Super Bowl just to show us Coca-Cola and good times. Because that way, I asked a Coke advertising exec one time, like, how is it worth it? Like, why do y'all spend so much money? Everyone knows Coke is way better than Pepsi. Everybody knows. And that's not just an Atlanta thing. That's objective, empirical, blind taste test. All right, everybody knows it. Is Pepsi okay? No. Has it ever been? No. So I asked this guy, like, why do you guys spend that money? He's like, because we want to reinforce happiness, positivity with the Coke brand. Guys, and we buy into it. Literally, we buy it. This is how it works. If you keep getting hit with the same message, you subconsciously, it works underneath your consciousness. You start to believe it. And so for 40 days and 40 nights, 80 times now, the army, Saul, they've heard this. You are the servants of Saul. You are the servants of Saul. David hadn't heard that. So the first time he shows up and hears that, he goes, you are defying the armies of the living God. Do you see how different the authority is if you believe you're the servants of Saul versus the army of God? If you're the servants of Saul, Goliath is trouble. If you're the armies of God, Goliath is nothing. David hadn't heard that lie. They had been terrified by it. Guys, if the truth will set you free, then lies are what have bound you. And we have believed lies. Every one of us have. We haven't just been hit 40 days by lies. Some of us have been hit for 40 years. We wake up every morning, not good enough. Don't have what it takes. Not lovable. Not smart. I'm stupid. This isn't abstract me just thinking. Guys, this is me having prayed with dozens and dozens and dozens of leaders over the last 10 years through worship school. We have people, faithful, talented, anointed, godly men and women from around the world that when you sit with them and ask, what do you believe about yourself? And they're honest, they say, not good enough, never will be, stupid. And I get that. I experienced that. I grew up in church, man. Church, we're great at putting shame on people. I remember a teacher told me when I was a kid, shame on you. I was like, I've got plenty of shame on me. You don't need to put any more. Don't worry. I grew up with it. Shame's like my love language. And it was about 7 or 8 years ago, praying in my house with a worship school class, saying, God, what have I believed? What lies have I believed? What billboards just keep hitting me? What do I believe? What are the lies? Here's what it was. That you're an unworthy son. I believed it my whole life. Grew up in fundamentalism, born at Bob Jones Hospital. Come on. You know I'm going to have counseling in my future. Unworthy son, not good enough, guilty, filthy, shameful. And then it's like, God, what do you say that I am? You know what he said? He said, I call you a worthy father. I don't feel like a worthy father all the time. I had never considered myself such until he said that. That changed my future. Do you know how much harder it is to live under a curse than to live into a blessing? But if we're just believing the lies, and guys, I'm telling you, I really have a sense, it's not just 40 days that you've heard lies about yourself, you've got decades. People have told you things, the enemy has told you things, you've told yourself things, and we have colluded with hell. But David hadn't heard those lies, and he hears them for the first time, and he is offended, he is insulted, and he won't stand for it. He knows what's true. We're not the servants of Saul. We're the armies of God, and that changes everything. See, if we're living out of our true identity and walking in that inherent authority where others see threats, we see opportunity. If you just see yourself, guys, as a member of Grace Snellville, it's not a lot of authority. That's why we want you to know exactly what God says he's called you to do, what he's made you for, what he's empowered you in. Because you're way more than just a member of Grace. You're so much more than a sinner saved by grace. So sick of that gospel. You're just a sinner saved by grace. You're just a sinner saved by grace. A good thing he loves you because you're garbage. You're so much more than a sinner saved by grace. You're a child of the living God. You're joint heir with Christ Jesus. You are justified. You are being glorified. You are completely free from the power of sin. You've been redeemed. You carry the glory of God in your body. You're a child of heaven. You're a citizen of promise. You're the head. You're not the tail. You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. So stop telling me all I am is a sinner saved by grace. You're not just the servants of Saul. You're the child of God. And the world needs a body of people who know who they are, who know what they carry, can do it with authenticity, do it in humility, and step in with authority to set other people free. Come on. So what does it look like then? We're going to land the plane. To be a child of the King, what does that mean? Does that mean we can just be health and wealth church? Prosperity gospel? We're kids of the King. Come on, bring up the Learjet, baby. Is that what that means? Because that looks great on TV. Well, what did it look like for the actual begotten Son of the King? Learjets? He gave his life away. What it looks like to be a child of the King isn't to live for yourself, it's to give yourself. It's to empty yourself. It's to serve, to take up a towel and a basin. That's what it looks like. That's the problem with that kind of gospel. So ultimately in this story, we're not just like David, we need to fight our Goliaths. We're like Israel, powerless, terrified, afraid, needing a champion, needing someone to step in, needing to go to war for us. And that is what we have in Jesus. We have a Savior who has overcome death. He has taken down the giant. He's done it all for us, and he didn't do it through taking anyone's life. He did it through giving his life. See, a whole different way. It's like Goliath had never even considered that this would be a way that this fight could go. God, his ways are higher than your ways. His thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And Jesus might not have been what we would have wanted. He is exactly what we needed. Tim Keller, I love it. He said this in a sermon on Moses. He said, God said to Moses, not tell them I am what you want. God said, tell them I am what I am. So growing up in that fundamentalist upbringing in church, a lot of repentance. Every Sunday I was like, come forward, feel how wretched you are. My invitation for you is to repent and feel how loved you are. Fix your thinking by fixing your eyes on the love of Jesus. Jesus said, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. That is so much love. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. You can't get any more love than that. And so all I hope this morning is that maybe you'll finally stop trying to fight the battles on your own. How's that working out for you, by the way? And fix your eyes on Jesus, the only one who can topple your giants anyway. You, in and of yourself, in your strength, you can't do this. You haven't been able to until now. But through surrender, through looking at Jesus, through coming back to Jesus, through stepping into what he's given you to do and what he's called you to be, well, there's no question that you can do this. Last verse, this kind of sums it up, and the band can come on up. 2 Peter 1, verse 3, it says this. It says, God's divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence. Do you hear that? His divine power has granted to us all things pertaining to life and godliness. The way that the language works there is that the tense means something has happened in the past with ramifications into the future. His divine power has granted you all things pertaining to life and godliness. That's not a promise. That's not an it will be. That is an it is. It is. It has been. It is done. You have it. You've got it. Now let's step into it. Let's surrender into it. Let's walk into this. So, whatever you're up against, we're going to worship, we're going to sing. Whatever you're facing, whatever your giant might look like, what would it look like this morning? To just fall at the feet of Jesus and say, I'm powerless against this thing. I'm stuck. It might be a secret no one knows. It might be a pattern that's now just a full out addiction. I don't know what your giant is. I have no idea. But I do know there is a son of David who's a good shepherd who came out of a wilderness in power, just like little shepherd boy David. And he conquered the enemy that you never could so that you could live a life that you were always destined for.